This is his third visit. In 2015, he covered the yearly history of Mini Glacier Hotel, which you can't get to right now, on the eve of the centennial, and in 2019, he talked about the Great Northern Railway's Lewis Hill is, you say manipulation, but I call it mischief, with promoting Glacier Park through the media. So with that, thank you for coming back, and we look forward to your presentation. The books, he's got books here, $25. You're not going to find a better, well-researched, more detailed on the jammers out there. There's several other books out there that top, but that one, you do go in detail. So it's a great book, and thank you for coming.
I guess those tickets are out of the way. Well, thank you for having me back. I'm honored to be here, coming to the Flathead and Glacier. Thank you for having me back. I'm honored to be here. Coming to the Flathead and Glacier is like coming home. Everyone is so welcoming, and I feel like I'm among family. If not, I'm certainly among friends. And tonight I want to take you behind the scenes a little bit and let you discover how Glacier got its red buses and how they went from utility vehicles to iconic status. We owe a debt of thanks to Howard Hayes for the fact that the red buses, White Motor Company Model 706s, are in Glacier. He had a hand in their selection, helped draft the guidelines for their design. He decided to purchase them. And when others were abandoning the Model 706s for newer vehicles, he kept them in service, a decision that laid the foundation for their continued existence. So to understand how Glacier got its buses, you first have to know a little bit about Hayes. Briefly, Hayes was born and raised in Metropolis, Illinois, also the home of Superman. Metropolis is a farming community, if you don't know, in the Ohio River Valley, about midway between Nashville, Tennessee and St. Louis, Missouri. Following graduation from high school, he waited for a year to attend college so he could earn enough for tuition, which gives you a little bit of a sense of, he came from a modest family. At college, Hayes took pre-law courses, but he was an overachiever, and as a result, he had a nervous breakdown. And to give you an idea of why, let's just look a little bit at his schedule. Besides taking a full course load, Hayes was a member of the Adelphic Literary Society, where he excelled at debate and oratory. He was a private in the University Militia Regiment. He was on the staff of the university newspaper, and he had a part-time job to pay for his room and board. So as much as he tried, he was no Superman. Hayes was told he needed to get some rest in the outdoors to calm his nerves and restore his health. That's how he ended up in Yellowstone in 1906, working for the Wiley Camping Company. First as a driver of horse and buggy tour guide, before quickly working himself up to the role of sales manager, often giving magic lanterns slide talks that he pitched about Yellowstone. You can see a brochure on the left-hand side there for one of them. Hayes worked for Wiley until the rationalization of concession services in Yellowstone starting about 1916. And he left to go to Chicago to work at a railway ticket office for the Union Pacific and Chicago and Northwestern Railways. When the First World War broke out, he was selected to run the Mountain Park Tours and Advertising section for the Railroad Administration. In 1918, Hayes' friend, Roe Emery, came to him with a wild proposition. Emery wanted to buy up all the concessions in Yellowstone, in Glacier, and in Rocky Mountain National Parks, and run them as a single huge corporation. At the time, Emery was running the Glacier Park Bus Company and had recently expanded to operate the transportation concession in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. Emery's financier for both Glacier and Rocky was Walter White. Not that Walter White. That one. This is Walter White. He was the co-founder and president of the White Motor Company in Cleveland, Ohio. The White Motor Company had supplied all the vehicles used by Emery for his transportation services, in both Rocky Mountain Park as well as Glacier. White said he would raise the money for the buyout that they were planning if Emery and Hayes could arrange the deals. Hayes and Emery tried their darndest, but got hung up getting the Yellowstone concessioner, Harry Child, to agree to terms they could meet, and the buyout fell apart. What it came down to was Harry Childs wanted cash on the barrelhead. If he didn't get it, no way. Walter White could raise the money, but not in one lump sum. So if they had been able to do that, swing it, I think it was $250,000 was all Harry Child wanted. They could have had everything. The Great Northern was ready to sell out to them. As a consolation, Hayes, Emery, and White purchased the former Wiley Camping Company in Yellowstone, with Hayes managing it as the newly named Yellowstone Park Camps. Over the next 6 years, Hayes managed the company, increasing the profits of the camps by converting them from tents to cabins and building lodges at locations such as Roosevelt Camp. Much of today's older hospitality industry infrastructure in Yellowstone was built by Hayes. In 1924, Hayes contracted tuberculosis, and by mutual agreement, Emery, White, and Hayes sold the camping company, with Hayes going to Riverside, California to recuperate. Hayes had barely regained his health when National Park Service Director Stephen Mather came knocking on his door and asked Hayes to take over the Sequoia and Kings Canyon concessions from the Curry family company, basically to turn them around. Curry was losing money on them, and Mather figured that Hayes could do it. So Hayes operated that concession actually right up until the mid-1960s when he sold out. Hayes had barely gotten Sequoia under control in 1926 when Roe Emery approached Hayes to take over the Glacier Bus Company as a one-third partner. Emery wanted to concentrate his efforts on Rocky Mountain National Park in Denver. And that's how Hayes ended up in Glacier as a part owner and president of the bus company. By that point, he'd been working in national parks for almost continuously since 1916. So 20 years, he was quite up to the challenge. One of the major reasons Hayes took over the bus concession in Glacier was ongoing construction of Going to the Sun Road, or the Trans Mountain Road as it was known then. Hayes was convinced that it would become a major attraction, which meant the possibility of even more profits from the already profitable bus company. In preparation for Sun Road, in anticipation of a windfall, Hayes ordered 2 Model 54 buses from the White Motor Company, which arrived in the summer of 1927. They carried more passengers than the standard buses that the company was using. They had hydraulic brakes and that could handle the descent on Sun Road. Plus they had a more powerful engine to tackle the 6% incline going up the Logan Pass. Now, trivia question for you. Do you know what happened to this bus? I'm sure somebody does. Actually, that's it. It's owned by the National Park Service and it's in storage in West Glacier, awaiting the day that they build a museum to permanently display it. Some of you may have spotted it at the Belton Depot. It's been on display there a number of summers. Unfortunately, a park museum seems to be a long-held dream, and I'm not sure whether this bus will ever show up in a museum. But let's get back to the story. So completion of the full length of Sun Road in 1932 did 3 things for Glacier. First, it opened the interior of the park to automobile traffic. Sun Road was an acknowledgement that automobiles were becoming an everyday part of life of average Americans, and they wanted to see the park that way rather than on buses or organized tours. Before Sun Road, the only way to get into the backcountry of Glacier was on a saddle horse trip or by hiking. People simply weren't willing to pay for that privilege and wanted to be able to tour the national parks on their own and in the comfort of their own cars. Second, with the road open, people flocked to the park in droves, and Sun Road became the top attraction. Let me walk you through some numbers here, just to give you some idea. Until Sun Road opened in 1933, the full length, it was in a depression-induced decline, and you can see that by looking at the numbers for 1931 and 32. You see how it's dropping. So the numbers going from 59 down to 53,000. But with the opening of Sun Road, all of a sudden visitation hit 76,000 in 1933. That beat the previous annual, top annual record of 73,000. And just 3 years later, visitation had nearly tripled in 1936. Yeah, from to 210,000, so that's by 1936. So from hauling 10% of all park visitors in 1931, the percentage for Hayes dropped to 4.2%. So you can see the drop here in the bus share of the number of tourists coming through. Basically, Hayes was losing ground. Although the number of people riding the buses, you can see, has jumped from 6,000 in 1931 to 9,100 in 36. In fact, he was losing out. He was basically back where he was before, but he wasn't getting ahead because of the increased number of tourists. The third point about Sun Road is that it made Hayes realize the vehicles he was using to transport passengers were old. The majority of the buses that made up the Glacier fleet were this model 1545 that you see here. It's the same type that Dale Djuff was hoping to bring to us to see today. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do so. Those buses were designed in 1920, and while they were well maintained and they were adequate for the job, they could handle Sun Road. They were definitely not modern looking, certainly, especially when compared to changing standards of the time. The same year that Sun Road opened, Ford introduced the newly redesigned sedan featuring a V8 engine. The aerodynamic design was an affordable sensation, replacing as it did the Model A and the Model B before it. And this particular Ford would become infamous because it was the car in which outlaws Bonnie and Clyde were killed in the next year, 1934. Now, this is a 1929 Ford Accord that was styled by Count Alexis de Sagnovsky, and it's an example of where vehicles were headed back in the day. Vehicle designers had picked up on Art Deco, and there was an aircraft-inspired takeoff from that called Streamline Moderne that followed it. And these trends blew away all of the previous styles that were used for automobiles. The Sagnovsky's cord body is an early example of Streamline Moderne. The white model 1545 buses looked like Grandpa's jalopy compared to that. Howard Hayes analyzed all of those factors and realized he needed to change with the times. His bread and butter, did I skip? I apologize if I skipped that. That was the concept. His bread and butter was serving travelers who rode the Great Northern Railway trains to the park. But he also realized there were other potential riders he could serve. With new buses, Hayes figured he could lure people out of their cars, especially people driving models that might struggle to get up to Logan Pass. Hayes also knew that the prospect of driving on mountain roads scared the heck out of some people. Hayes' sales pitch to new customers was simple. Why risk straining your vehicle or your mental health when you could sit in comfort, enjoy the trip in a new bus driven by somebody who knew the road? If Hayes could lure even 1% of all the people arriving in Glacier by car, he would double his business. So in the summer of 1935, Hayes began discussions about creating a new national park bus with Billy Nichols, who was the head of the transportation company in Yellowstone, and Don Tressiter, who had married into the Curry family at the time that ran the concessions in Yosemite National Park. Yellowstone had the biggest fleet of buses in any of the Western National Parks, and Tressiter was the head of the Conference of Western Concessioners, so both were very influential men when it came to concessioner policy and National Park Service policy. In earlier times, Hayes would have simply gone to Walter White for help. Given that Hayes knew him personally, Walter was an investor in the Glacier Park Bus Company, and because White had supplied every bus that was running in Glacier and just about every national park in the West. Unfortunately, Walter White died in a car crash in 1929, and the White Company had been adrift without his leadership. So the White Company lost its status as the first stop of a source for new buses. it was not as if White didn't have vehicles to offer. This Model 614 was tested in Yellowstone and Yosemite. Other concessionaires, though, looked elsewhere. In Rainier, at the top, they tried Kenworth buses, as they did at Grand Canyon, which is at the below left. I don't know what the vehicle is that's used in Zion, right over here, but it just gives you another example of where concessionaires were looking for some vehicle to replace this old Model 1545, which just about everybody drove, but nobody quite knew what they needed. In Glacier, the White Company sold a single Indiana bus for Hayes to test in 1935. If this Indiana, number 77 in the Glacier feed, looks strikingly familiar to the red buses, you're right, but you're also getting ahead of me. The Indiana was a truck company that the White Motor Company acquired, and White featured the Indiana models on its floor right beside its own vehicles. Neither the 614 nor the Indiana filled the bill that concessionaires wanted. The idea that Tressiter, Nichols, and Hayes came up with to fill that void was to hold a design competition between a number of different manufacturers and decide on the best one. Coach builders were also invited to attend, with tentative designs that could be tailored to fit the wish list of the concessionaires, as well as whatever would fit on what particular chassis they chose. The thinking of the concessionaires was that if they could agree on a single model of bus that would serve all of their needs, they could get a better price by bulk ordering rather than individually custom ordering buses. So Ford, REO, General Motors, and White were invited to bring test chassis to Yosemite in December 1935 for testing. Now, I just want to remind you, in commercial truck production now as back then, the manufacturer offers a stripped cab chassis. Namely, it's a frame, it's got an engine, it usually has an engine covering and a cowl, and it may include part of a cab, but anything back of the cab is left off. The idea is that the buyer can decide how to finish it. Thus, that was the reason for inviting coach builders, was to figure out how to design the rest of the bus. Now, many concessionaires were invited to the competition, but only a handful actually showed up. Now, those who attended were Hayes, Tressiter, and Nichols, and they also brought along their transportation managers. Others, such as Don Hummel, then getting a start in Glacier National Park, Jackson Price of Crater Lake, were invited, but declined to attend. Hayes' partner, Roe Emery, and George Mulliger, who was Hayes' brother-in-law and running the concession in Sequoia, left the decisions up to Hayes. You can kind of get the sense that Hayes is becoming a particular prime player in this whole thing. During discussions with the designers, the concessionaires came up with a list of about 15 items that they wanted included in any new bus. They included that the bus be capable of carrying 13 people, the driver and 13 passengers, so 14 people, that it have 4 rows of seating with a door providing access to each row. There'd be an option for 5 rows of seating, seating 17 people. The seats had to be covered with leather or naugahyde. The bus featured a rollback top, and that the bus had a luggage compartment at the rear. And access to the luggage compartment was to be via 2 dust-proof doors. Why? Well, the dust-proof luggage compartment may seem odd until you look at how luggage was toted back in the day. It was piled on a fold-down rack at the back of the buses and covered with a tarp. It took until the mid-1950s, you got to realize, that it took until then for most roads in Glacier to be paved. So dust getting into and onto luggage from the buses being driven on gravel roads and dirt roads was a big issue. That's why dust-proof. Now, the separate luggage compartment in the White Model 54 and in the Indiana was the inspiration for trying a sealed luggage compartment and making that a component of the new buses. The luggage compartment, in this case, is behind the 5th row of seats in the Model 54. It was accessed by a side door, and that would be very much what Hayes would be looking at. But let's get back to the design competition for a minute. As I mentioned, there were 4 competitors. Hayes and Company had expected REO to bring a 2L4 or 24LH chassis, the latter of which you see here in finished form as a bus. Instead, REO brought a cab-forward design where the driver sits up beside the engine, like in an English double-decker bus if you've ever seen one. It was so radically different from anything the concessionaires had ever encountered before, they immediately dismissed it. Ford had a Model 48 bus with full coachwork. It was the only manufacturer to have a fully finished bus ready for trial tests. The Model 48 shown here had been tested in Yellowstone during the summer of 1935, so they had a good idea how it worked. While Ford might have had an advantage bringing a bus that was completely ready, its ride characteristics were so bad it was ruled out. It was tested first with 8 people and it rode smoothly to the point that Trusteder said it was as good as any Cadillac he had. But when you loaded it with 14 people, he said the bus just bounced around in a way that passengers simply would not accept. So Ford's out of the picture. GMC had initially been reluctant to enter the design competition, which is kind of weird, and only decided at the last minute to get involved after learning that Ford would be there. Basically, we're not going to let Ford get away with this. Unfortunately, GMC had a problem as well. It brought a T18B truck chassis instead of a softer sprung bus chassis. The truck chassis was simply ill-suited for the type of ride the concessionaires were looking for, so it was eliminated. That left the White Motor Company as the last manufacturer standing. It brought 2 models for the competition, a Model 704 and a Model 706. Now remember, I mentioned it was a stripped cab, so nothing behind the cowl existed. It was simply a frame, and the driver basically sat on a jury-rigged seat. So don't think it was this bus that showed up. The Model 706 obviously won the day, although concessionaires wanted the larger capacity engine, a 318 cubic inch, which was eventually put in. Basically, they figured that much power was needed to be able to handle mountain roads. Now, in choosing White to manufacture the new bus, by default, Count Alexis de Sagnovsky, a refugee from Kiev, in what is now Ukraine, became the designer of the bus. He was a freelance designer who had worked for the White Company and other vehicle manufacturers, as well as makers of consumer products. So he actually designed watches, bicycles, and even refrigerators. Now, you see elements of streamlined modern in the origins of the Model 706 bus, and this de Sagnovsky sketch he did for an earlier vehicle, a 700 truck. Note especially the front fenders of the truck and the grille. It's noteworthy that de Sagnovsky was actually working on a new design for a white vehicle grilles back in 1935. I'm not sure if the Model 706 was the first to feature the new grille design. If not the first, then certainly one of the first. It's amazing the patent actually still exists. Now, back to the design here just for a minute. When the concessionaires were talking to the body companies about the coachwork for the new buses, I had mentioned that the original design was that the bus would carry 14 people, 13 passengers and a driver. I also mentioned there was an option for 17 people. It was Hayes who made that request. At the time, the National Park Service restricted seating in the Model 1545 that you see there to 11 people. Although the driver of this bus, Hector Boscati, is actually carrying 13. And who was Hector to complain when you've got a bunch of beautiful women all sitting in your bus and crowding in there? He wasn't gonna. So, yeah, they got away with it. Hayes was willing to give up the sealed luggage compartment, which you see in the original specification Yellowstone bus here, for a 5th passenger door that provided seating for an additional 3 people. Now, here's a little tidbit for you. This bus, once on display at the Historic Flight Museum outside of Spokane, looks like it escaped from Glacier. It's red, it has the appropriate logo on the side, and is a Model 706, but it's not a Glacier bus. Look at the photo at the right, revealing the ambulance-style doors to the luggage compartment. That's the giveaway. Only Glacier buses have 5 passenger doors on one side. The back is sealed. When you see those doors to a luggage compartment, you know it's not a Glacier bus. This one is a repainted Yellowstone bus. So why was Hayes so determined for those 5 doors and the 3 extra passengers? Well, first of all, 3 passengers would mean a 23% increase in revenue just from fares. The extra carrying capacity would also mean that Hayes could run the bus company with fewer vehicles, and as a result save on maintenance and the cost of gasoline. In 1929, forgive me, I think I may have skipped something. Sorry, that's an original 1936 bus having just arrived in Glacier. In 1929, the Glacier Park Transportation Company was operating 52 buses capable of carrying 582 passengers. Hayes could cut the number of buses to 36 from 52, and would be capable of carrying 600 people if each new bus carried 16 passengers. And to meet that the 600 was kind of a critical number for Hayes. That was the largest group the Great Northern Railway ever booked to tour Glacier at one time. They all had to be handled. So he needed enough bus capacity to handle 600, which is why Hayes really wanted that extra seating capacity outside of the extra revenue. They didn't, in fact, did not buy 36 buses. They bought 35 instead, and kept 2 of the old buses, the Indiana and the Model 54, to be able to make up that 600 seating arrangement. The biggest cost saving of all was reducing the cost of labor by at least 30%. Staffing would go from a big crew like you see here in 1927, with some but not all of the 60 or so drivers needed to run the company, to about 40 drivers, 32 of which you're seeing here in this 1939 photo. Major drop in staff and costs. Hayes did not tell anybody about his intention to run the new buses with more passengers. When they arrived, he left them as they were delivered, so the 5th row door led to the luggage storage area. That's evident when you look at this photo, where you see the chrome bars across the door window and the back window, as well as between that luggage area and the 4th row seating. The bars were meant to prevent luggage from being tossed around and possibly breaking the windows, and also from hitting passengers. The bars were removed in part to carry more passengers back there, and also so it wouldn't look like people in a bloody paddy wagon. You can imagine the reaction you'd be back there, let me out, let me out. When the new buses arrived in 1936, Hayes also never bothered to tell Glacier's superintendent that his version of the bus could carry more people than a normal version. Instead, he said the buses only carried 14, like all the others. It was only once the buses were here that he removed the bars, installed a bench seat, that Scoyan actually found out that they would carry more people. By that time, it was too damn late. They were already here. When the new buses showed up for the 1936 season, the drivers were gobsmacked at the modern design and the features compared to what they had been driving. The Model 706 had electric lights. The previous bus had acetylene lights that you had to pump and light and weren't very bright. These buses also had power-assisted brakes. They had roll-up windows versus canvas side curtains that you had to roll down or install when it rained. They even had ashtrays for smokers. The only feature that they were missing were 2. One was a heater. And Hayes, being a bit of a cheapskate, figured it was cheaper to buy a blanket than it was to install a heater in the house. Also, being a frugal man, let's see, the buses didn't have signal lights. So you remember the old way when you learned to ride a bicycle?
Yeah.
You know, left turn, right turn, slow down. That's what the drivers had to do. They had to stick their arm out. There were no signal lights. What you see here is a picture of a bus that was taken later. This is number 78, which is in park storage. That is an aftermarket signal that they installed in the late 1950s. So you can imagine those drivers at the time, and everybody was doing that. If you had a Model A, you will know that as well, although you can install signal lights in them. So Now, one of the drivers who was there when those buses came in 1936 was John Turner. He wouldn't get to drive one, unfortunately, until the next year because all the new buses were given to the old drivers, the guys who'd been there at least 2 years or more. But I talked to John Turner about the buses when they arrived, and this is what he said to me. He said, the new buses were like going from a horse and buggy to a new Cadillac. We didn't require any instructions, just a clean towel to wipe away our tears of joy. Now, despite Hayes' hopes, things didn't turn around for him quite as he'd expected, at least not immediately. Well, that's a lot of numbers here. Let me kind of point out a few to help you understand this. In 1927 and 1928, bus company income was rising, and the rate of return in the far right column, on this side, was well into the double digits. Despite Sun Road opening in 1933, the bus company actually ended up in the red. You can see the earnings are minus numbers. Sun Road, though, meant an end to the depression-induced losses for the bus company. The new buses began arriving in 1936, and combined with increases in park visitation, the bus company's revenue and profits both increased, but not nearly to the pre-depression levels. That wouldn't happen until after the Second World War in 1946, before you started getting back into numbers that looked like pre-depression numbers. So, what happened? Well, rather than pocket the profit that the bus company was making after the buses arrived and Sun Road opened, Hayes instead took the money that he earned and shoveled it back into paying for the buses. Each bus cost around $4,700. Hayes bought 35 of them between 1936 and 1939. So he owed White about $164 for the buses. Hayes wanted the debt paid as quickly as possible, and did so before the start of the Second World War. The effort to cut into the company profit, but in the long run, paid greater rewards, and that's where you saw in 1946 where things were turning around. By the time the Second World War ended and tourism in Glacier resumed in 1946, the oldest red buses were now 10 years old. Hayes figured he'd have to replace them at some time. So he started a fund into which he started depositing money annually. By 1955, he'd amassed $100,000, so well on the way to covering the original cost of the buses. While Hayes had money in hand to replace them, there was no need. First of all, the buses accumulated very few miles. They were only driven 3,000 miles a year. Amazing. So by 1955, the oldest buses hadn't even hit 60,000 miles, despite being 20 years old. They were also well maintained. During the summer, the mechanics would log every driver complaint, and then they would spend the winter taking care of the buses and things that they couldn't tackle over the summer during the season. So over the winter, the buses would get repainted, suspension issues would be dealt with, and engines would be overhauled. Hayes sold the bus company to the Great Northern Railway in 1955. At that point, he was 71 years old, plus he had other business adventures to keep him busy, including Sequoia, which I mentioned he held until the 1960s, as well as he owned 2 newspapers in Riverside, California, where he recuperated and established as his home. In making the sale, Hayes showed railway officials assessments that the buses could soldier on for probably another 30 years. So it would have taken him to 1985. Great Northern Railway officials accepted those appraisals, but within a year, they were already talking about replacing them. And in fact, they sent a representative up to Banff to take a look at what Brewster was doing. Brewster at the time was checking out Volkswagen vans. And this brochure you see is actually one of the ones that representative came back with. Although they were inexpensive, and you see the price written right there, $3,000. So even cheaper than the red buses. They were noisy, and passengers complained bitterly about the ride. So the buses survived another day. Great Northern wasn't going to do anything. The Great Northern sold all of the buses and the hotel company to Don Hummel and Associates from Tucson, Arizona in 1960. With previous experience in both Lassen and in McKinley National Park, Hummel had a tight rein on things. He knew what he was doing and kind of followed the Hayes principle. Replacing the buses was not a high priority. In fact, the $100,000 that Hayes had saved was used by Hummel to cover his first year's expenses, so he wouldn't have to go to the bank and take out a loan. He had cash in hand. As a result, the buses soldiered on, getting new engines in the mid-1960s when they hit the 100,000-mile mark, but beyond that, regular maintenance. Hummel sold the concession in 1981, and its new owner, Greyhound Food Management, today's Pursuit, kept running the buses much as Hummel had done. In 1989, the buses, though, came in for a major overhaul, getting new engines and automatic transmissions. It was the first time bus drivers, called gear jammers, no longer had to shift gears. Wow. And just an FYI, people call the buses jammers? No, that's like calling an airplane a pilot. You wouldn't say, oh, that's a beautiful ship captain, or no, captain ship. And when you say jammer bus, you're saying essentially driver bus. So the drivers are jammers, the buses are buses, or revs. Anyway, that overhaul of the buses in 1989 marked a significant change in attitude about them. Starting in the 1950s, National Park concessionaires across the West began replacing the Model 706s that they had bought with new equipment, like you see here in Yellowstone. Hayes had considered it, the Great Northern, when it bought the buses, considered it. Hummel kind of considered it. But what they realized is that the largest fleet of 706s with, Yellowstone, had the largest fleet of 706s with 99, and it got rid of them all. By the mid-1960s, they had all been sold or scrapped. What stopped the move in Glacier was simple: Sun Road. Sun Road has, as you know now, a length restriction, 21 feet. The buses are 25 feet. They were grandfathered in. The problem with that and other new equipment is that nothing was under 25 feet. And there was no way the National Park Service would approve it. So even if Pursuit, GPI, whatever you want to call it, back in the 1980s and 90s, wanted new equipment, there was nobody that offered it. And as well, they had that sense that we have something special here. So when they came to that 1989 redoing of the buses, it had finally dawned on the company and the National Park Service that they had something pretty special. Here was the oldest fleet of continuously operating commercial touring vehicles in the world. The red buses had gone from utility vehicles, something that would normally be replaced after a certain amount of time, to that when it wore out, to now being a historic asset worth preserving. Suddenly, a red bus tour was highly prized by tourists, an experience from an earlier time that you could only get in Glacier. That new understanding of just what the red buses represented was a major factor that eventually saw Ford refurbish the fleet in the 2000s. As you'll recall, the buses were taken off the road in 1999 because of safety issues. Glacier Park Inc. simply did not have the money to restore the buses. So a deal was made to have GPI donate them to the National Park Foundation that would then turn them over to Ford, which would